It's a joy to be with you this morning in church, and thanks to your rector, Cindy, for her invite and her words of welcome. What I want to do for a few moments this morning, in verse 16 there in John's Gospel, chapter 3, there is a whole concept about God loving us, forgiving us through the sacrifice on Calvary. But in my context, growing up in that very bitter sectarian war in the northern part of Ireland for 30 years, for many of us who were clergy and faith leaders, we had to ask the honest question: can theology or faith actually make a difference in the public space? Or is theology just confined to the kind of rarefied atmosphere of church on a Sunday morning? So just for a few moments, I want us to try to wrestle together with this whole concept of forgiveness in the public space. C.S. Lewis, as many of you know, was a well-known Anglican of another generation. He was born in Belfast, born into that very sectarian cockpit of the northern part of Ireland. He went on to be professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, one of the greatest Christian minds of the 20th century. But C.S. Lewis, commenting on forgiveness, said this: everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. So what I want to do this morning is we're going to do a world tour, wrestling and struggling with that whole concept of forgiveness. Many of you know the name of Simon Wiesenthal, the very well-known and famed Nazi hunter who survived the German concentration camp. Simon lost 89 family members to the Nazis. And he spent most of his life, as many of us know in this building, tracking down former Nazi war criminals. And people often asked him about his obsession. They said, "Simon, why are you hunting men in their 70s and their 80s for crimes that were committed almost half a century ago? Is there no forgiveness for such people? Is there no reconciliation?" And Simon Wiesenthal set out his answers in a very small, slim, powerful book entitled The Sunflower. And if you've read the book begins with a very haunting story of remembrance of an event that took place during Simon Wiesenthal's imprisonment. He was selected at random from a work detail, yanked aside, taken up a back stairway to a hospital corridor. A nurse then led him to a darkened room and left him alone with this very pitiful figure, wrapped in white, lying on a bed. It was a German officer, badly wounded, swathed in yellow-stained bandages, and gauze covered his entire face. And in this very weak and trembling voice, the officer proceeded to offer, I guess, what we could only call this morning a kind of sacramental confession. He recounted his boyhood and early days in the Hitler Youth movement. He told of action along the Russian front and of the increasingly harsh measures that his SS unit were taking against the Jewish populace. He tells the story where his unit herded all the Jews from one town into a wooden frame building, and they torched the building. He said some of the Jews, their clothes ablaze, leaped in desperation from the second floor, and the SS soldiers, he among them, shot them as they fell. He started to tell the story of one little boy, a young boy with black hair and piercing dark eyes, but his voice gave way. And several times during this encounter, Simon Wiesenthal attempted to leave the room. Every time he did, this strange, mummy-like figure reached out and restrained him. And finally, after what was almost 2 hours, the officer explained to Simon Wiesenthal why he had summoned a Jewish prisoner. He asked the nurse, "Do any Jews still exist?" And if so, he said, "I want one brought to my room before death." He said to Simon Wiesenthal, "I know what I'm asking you is too much. But without your answer, I cannot die in peace." And then he asked forgiveness for all the crimes that he had committed against the Jews. So visualize that. He's imploring a human being who the next day may die at the hands of his SS comrades. Simon Wiesenthal said, "I stood in silence for some time, staring at the man's bandaged face, and at last I made up my mind. I left the room without saying a word, leaving the soldier to die in torment unforgiven." If you've read Simon Wiesenthal's book, it devotes 90 pages to that story. And for the next 105 pages, he lets others speak, because he sent the story to 32 people globally, Jewish rabbis, Christian theologians, secular philosophers, ethicists. He asked for their response. Did I do right? Should I have forgiven the dying SS criminal? The vast majority of respondents replied that Wiesenthal was right in leaving the soldier unforgiven. Only 6 thought he had done wrong. Some of the non-Christian respondents questioned the whole idea of forgiveness. They said it's a totally irrational concept that simply lets criminals off the hook and perpetuates injustice. Other people granted a place for forgiveness, but considered the heinous crimes of the Nazis as way beyond forgiveness. The most persuasive arguments came from people who insisted that forgiveness can only be granted by people who have been wronged. They said, what moral right? They asked, did Simon Wiesenthal to grant forgiveness on behalf of the Jews who had died at this person's hand? Today, I am not prepared, and I assume you're not prepared either, to pass judgment on that absolutely unbearable dilemma that faced Simon Wiesenthal in the hospital room. At least the 32 responses prove there are no simple answers to that question. But I'm going to tell you another story. It took place in New York City a few weeks ago when Joyce and I were there. It was about a business person who gave a woman several $1 million to invest for him. And over time, this woman made pretty bad investments, but finally came to settle up the account. She had to go to this businessman and say, I've lost your money. You could imagine his reaction. He trusts this person with an absolute fortune, and it's gone. The woman pleaded with him and eventually began to feel sorry for her. And he decided, as a grace-filled gesture, to write off her debts. Later that same evening, when she was in a cocktail bar in New York City, out celebrating her incredibly narrow escape, she met a friend, as she said, at the bar. And over a drink, she said to her, do you remember that $100 you owe me? As they sipped cocktails, you still haven't paid it back. The friend said, hey, listen, I've been in hospital, I have some bills. I will pay you back as soon as I can. But the woman, whether it was the headiness of the cocktail or her own personality, said, no, that's not good enough. You better pay it back or I'm going to see my lawyer. Her friend pleaded, look, give me a little bit more time. The woman wouldn't listen. And perchance, providence, coincidence, the businessman who wrote off the debts heard about this incident in a cocktail bar in New York City. And so he went to her place of business, confronted her and said, hey, listen, I showed you mercy when you couldn't repay me. Couldn't you have done the same for that poor woman? And because you're so lacking in mercy, I'm going to treat you just like you treated her. I'll see you in court. I lied. This didn't take place 3 weeks ago when Joyce and I were in New York City, so forgive me. Because it's simply a paraphrase of a story that I just brought into the 21st century that took place 2,000 years ago. And it's a story that Jesus told his followers. But Jesus didn't stop the story there, because he concluded it with a very thought-provoking statement. He said in Matthew 18, this is the way God the Father will treat each of you unless you, in turn, forgive others. Now, you imagine the impact that sentence had on Jesus' followers. All the time they assumed, as some of you did, that I was talking about money, and Jesus was talking about money when he was actually talking about forgiveness. And that's what makes this concept so profoundly difficult. Because behind Jesus' words lies this dynamic principle of the kingdom of heaven. We must forgive as we have been forgiven. Let me take you to Rome, Christmas Day, 1983. And Pope John Paul II goes into the Rubiba prison there to meet Mahet Ala Agala, who was the Turkish-born terrorist, who, if you recall, had attempted to murder him 2 years earlier. And the television cameras recorded that wordless encounter that made a very indelible impression on a world soaked by terrorism, bigotry, bloodshed, and hatred. If you remember the scene, the two men talked together in a prison room, their heads very, very close together. And when the Pope eventually emerged from the meeting, the world's media scrum asked him, what did you say? He said this: what we talked about will remain a secret between him and me, but I spoke to him as a brother whom I pardoned. 2 weeks later, Time magazine picked up the story. I still remember the front cover. It was in black, red question mark, with the phrase, why forgive? And the senior writer of Time magazine, Lance Morrow, wrote this. He says, Christ preached forgiveness. The loving of one's enemies, it is at the center of the New Testament. But he continued instead, stated nakedly, superficially, the proposition sounds perverse, even self-destructive, almost like an invitation to disaster. He says forgiveness is not an impulse that is much in favor. The prevalent style in the world runs much more akin to the mentality of the high plains drifter, the cold eye of the avenger, a numb remorselessness. But he finished with this sentence. He said, forgiveness does not look like a tool for survival in a bad world, but that is exactly what it is. Forgiveness does not look like a tool for survival in a bad world, but that is exactly what it is. September 1991. As a very young clergy person, I was involved in some conversations in Natal in South Africa, just as apartheid was painfully coming to an end. I remember speaking to this young woman. She was like 18. She was called Karina, lived in a township in South Africa. And the police had killed her older brother at a soccer game. Remember, I still close my eyes, visualize the scene, standing there by a very picturesque waterfall, and as the kind of so-called theology person, allegedly, to Karina, how do you deal with that? How do you cope with that? She said to me, as an impoverished black kid from a township in Natal, she said, I just did, Gary, what Jesus told me. I forgave him. So here's me, the Westerner, white, middle class, well-educated, being taught a lesson from this black, young, impoverished kid. And in my space in the Irish context, we've had to wrestle profoundly with these concepts, from forgiveness, servanthood, love, justice. We've had to ask ourselves the question, is theology only relevant, as I mentioned earlier, in church spaces for 1 hour on a Sunday morning? Can this gospel of grace actually spill into the public space and make a difference? An old preacher of another generation once said, too many churches are building $1 million salt depositories on street corners. But in reality, the church is meant to be a salt dispenser. So I ask you unashamedly, as a group of people who claim to follow this very disturbing first century preacher called Jesus Christ, is this church a salt depository where you come and you rub shoulders like little granules of salt every Sunday morning, and then you pop it into your top pocket until next Sunday morning, and in reality, it makes no real difference in the public space? Or is this church a church that spills out into the public domain? I know when I was in pastoral ministry for 28 years, people often used to ask me, and Cindy, you undoubtedly get these questions as well, rector, pastor, reverend, why is the world in such a mess? And although I often said tongue-in-cheek, I think it's probably the church's fault, because we don't spill out into the public space. We come together on Sunday morning, we give the choir points out of 10. The organist, I'm not reading you, I don't do that. Okay. The preacher and his preaching, and all it breeds is apathy and indifference. Let me give you Anglicans a little bit of Methodist theology that Methodists are not doing very well either in the Western world. We have a kind of twin-track approach to theology, personal holiness and social holiness. But let me quote an Anglican who talks about that, John Stott, the evangelical Anglican who died at the age of 92 a number of years ago. And he says, Methodist theology is like a bird with 2 wings, personal holiness and social holiness. You cut off one of the wings, the bird doesn't fly, the bird collapses. And as I look at Methodist churches, and I preach in many of them across this nation and globally, most Methodist churches have forgotten about social holiness. Or to use Wesley's phrase, my task is to spread scriptural holiness throughout the land, not just in the church. So maybe one of the reasons your space is the way it is, my space still struggles with the legacy of toxic theology and bad politics, is because our faith no longer spills into to the public space. So when Jesus had that encounter with Nicodemus all those years ago and told him he needed a new breath of the Spirit and it would make a difference, that Spirit should make you and me spill out into the public domain. And may it do so. Amen.